Well, welcome everybody. Just to give you a little background, I mean, I've been kind of a political nut for a long time, and I think it goes back to 1968 when so much was happening that year. I remember sitting with my mother in front of the TV, and Johnson was on the TV, and he was kind of a boring speaker, so she was sitting there doing some knitting, and all of a sudden he said, "I will not run for president of the United States again," and she just kind of nearly fell out of her chair. And then shortly after that, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then RFK got assassinated, and RFK had a very similar look as my father. There was definitely, they looked similar, and so it was very kind of tragic for me when he passed away. So since that time, and then went to the supermarket. My mother would buy these book series from Time Life about the presidents, which I still have. And so I've been very much interested in the topic for many, many years. And I'm so glad you're all here today, because my wife usually gets this glazed over look when I start talking about like the election of 1824 or 1860. So anyway, to begin with here, we're going to go over the electoral vote process overview of the 59 presidential elections. This one coming up is the 60th, which is pretty amazing.
In 6 months.
Yeah, coming up quick. If you look down with electoral votes, you can see over the years how it's changed from the original election down to the present. Currently, it's been 270 for a while, and that's what the magic number is to win. This is kind of hard to see here, but what I wanted to show was just how electoral votes have changed over time. When I was a kid, we used to play this game called I think it's called the President's Game, and you had to win electoral votes with my dad. It was an old game from the 1930s, and the electoral numbers were very different back then. And just to give you an idea, this is kind of what it looks like today. And the key things to look at here are what has changed. California went from 22 up to 55. Texas went from 23 to 38. Florida, which is amazing, from 7 to 29. And these ones that are in red are all the ones that went down, like New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They're all less than they were in 1936. So you can see these are kind of the key states that matter. New Jersey, even though it only has 14, it's still a prize. People want to win it. And then these are the 11 states, as I said, that people want to win, the same group that I just showed you there. These are the ones to watch out for in this election, because they're the ones that really will make the difference. Just state electors, now, this is a process that people are very confused about. They're like, what is this electoral college, all this kind of crazy stuff? And it's very different from state to state. Like 33 of the states choose it at a party convention, 7 do it at a state party committees, 10 states are gubernatorial appointments and party nominees. It's a very confused process, but in the end, each state decides how they pick their electors. The qualifications, like what makes this guy qualified to be an elector? The main thing is that they're currently active in the political process. You know, they're a member of a party, their current voter registration, that they pledge to abide by it. Now, the pledge is an interesting thing because some states are tougher on making sure that the electors follow what they're supposed to do. Faithless electors. We've all heard about this term. This is a major term that everybody's kind of, the last election, people were always looking for faithless electors, but they didn't really materialize. Where they really came out was in the 2016 election. But anyway, electors are chosen not to vote for the winner, but the popular vote, but for who the candidate is. The interesting thing here is that 90 instances of faithless electors have occurred for the president. But that number sounds really large, but the reason why it's so big is in the election of 1872, Horace Greeley dropped dead. And so 63 of his electors said, I'm not going to vote for a dead guy. So they switched over to Grant. So that was one of the things. But there's still actively a number of states. And New Jersey is one of the 20 states without a law seeking to bind votes to their electors. So if you're a person that's voting as an elector in New Jersey, you could switch and not have any kind of repercussion. This gives you an idea of how the vote usually goes. What you see over at the bottom here, this in 16, were the faithless electors that were chosen. And these are who were picked. You had Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton got the majority of the electoral votes. But you had 3 for Colin Powell from the state of Washington. Bernie Sanders got 1 from Hawaii. John Kasich got 1 from Texas, not even his home state. Ron Paul from Texas. And then Faith Spotted Eagle. She was the one non-politician that got a vote, for an electoral vote. and one of the few women that have received electoral votes in history. Now this, getting to the point of women receiving electoral votes, these are the women that have received electoral votes in the history of the U.S. Some of them, which is marked FE, are the faithless electors that have received, but then again, the vice presidential candidates that have run, like Geraldine Ferrara, Sarah Palin, and Hillary Clinton, all have received electoral votes for their own right. Hillary Clinton for the president. The New Jersey electoral votes is an interesting process in how it's changed over time. As the population grew, it got larger and larger. Its peak was between 1964 and 1980 when it had 17, and that's when it really mattered. And now it's gone back down to 14, so it's been consistent. It's still a prized number, but not one of the top ones. And this is an amazing picture I found. These are all the vice presidents of the United States up to this point. And as you can see, there's only been one woman and all men. And whether you love her or hate her, she's definitely a trailblazer in the process of vice presidents. And most of those individuals that were vice presidents would say that the job wasn't worth anything. It was the more recent vice presidents have had kind of more rigorous, kind of involvement. This is an interesting thing that took place back in the 1960s, was when it was actually challenged by Birchby to get rid of the Electoral College. Because everybody kind of sits there and says, we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. He actually did something about it. And the guy in the bottom here, Strom Thurmond, is the one who stopped it, to use his filibuster. And then he convinced people within Congress to actually vote against it. And so it never really passed, and we're still here with the Electoral College. But it was challenged at one point. Now this is an interesting thing, was the popular vote versus the Electoral College. Everybody likes to condemn the Electoral College. If you were in school and you got a 91, that's a pretty good grade. That's the grade of the Electoral College, as far as matching the popular vote and the electoral vote. These are only the 5 elections where the electoral vote the popular vote differed from the electoral vote, and that was 1824 and 76 and 88. And then unfortunately, 2 recent elections have also had similar outcomes. But that's how the Electoral College goes. This is some of the memorabilia. I collect political memorabilia, and Don does here as well. And these are some of the items that I have in my collection. So it's in one of my rooms in my house. But everything from a Jimmy Carter transistor radio to a JFK salt shaker, all different types of things. This is a neat thing here. It's actually Bush and Kerry, and you kind of push it like this, and they fight each other and box each other. I like anything that's kind of unusual. Going back to the first election, I'm going to go through all the different elections now briefly. You can get an overview of all the different ones. People will sit there and say that you cannot have an electoral vote that's not happening on a one-day, election day. In the first election, it went from December 15th, 1788 until January 10th, 1789. So the first election technically is not the election of 1788, it's the selection of 1788 and 89. And the outcome, of course, was George Washington with a unanimous vote, and he became the first president. And New Jersey cast their 6 electoral votes for Washington. George Washington's second election as well was another vote for him completely. 7 electoral votes for New Jersey because their population had picked up slightly by that time.
Brian, was he running unopposed in his second election?
Yes. Yeah, the first 2 elections were unopposed. Now the third...
132 is the number of electoral votes. Then what's the 28,579?
That's actually the popular vote.
Popular vote nationwide?
Yeah. You can see it was small. This is the election where it was first competitive, and this kind of got weird because the way the Constitution said, the guy who got the most votes become president, the number 2 became the vice president. These 2 are from different party affiliations, and they didn't really like each other too much. I mean, they had periods of time when they did like each other, periods some they didn't. When they got to the point of old age, they ended up corresponding again. At this point, they were pretty much opposed to each other. It was the first contested election, and it was also the first with political parties. These parties developed the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, and it's the only election where the president and vice president were elected from opposing tickets. They've tried to fix this later. New Jersey had 7 electoral votes for Adams. They went for Adams rather than Jefferson. This is also a crazy election with electoral votes, because all these other guys got electoral votes. There's no other election where you have such a variety of people receiving electoral votes. It's really a crazy election. The next election became an election that became a big problem because you had a situation where Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr both received the same amount of electoral votes. And one was the presidential candidate under the party of the Democratic Republicans, and the other was the VP. But Burr was kind of a little bit of a difficult guy. He was from the New York branch of the party, and Jefferson was from the southern part. He said, I got just as many as Jefferson, so I want to throw it into Congress for them to decide. Congress ultimately decided after 36 ballots, to choose Jefferson. And after that, they changed the Constitution with the 12th Amendment to make sure that this kind of situation would never happen, and that the president and the vice president become two separate positions that you would vote for, rather than causing the chaos that happened here. Now, Burr ends up the vice president, and you can see that Jefferson was not particularly happy with his vice president. So there was tension between the two of them during the entire presidency, and ultimately Burr actually killed Alexander Hamilton while he was a sitting vice president, which a lot of people don't realize. And then ultimately, when the term was over, he went off and had like a minor coup down in the South, and that caused some problems as well.
It's also the revolution of 1800.
Yeah.
It's also called the revolution of 1800.
Yeah.
Elections.
Yeah. Well, actually, I just went recently. If you want to have an interesting experience, you can go into the cemetery in Princeton, and I just visited Aaron Burr's grave, which is right there in Princeton. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's got American flags on it and stuff.
Isn't Grover Cleveland buried?
Yeah, I went and saw Grover Cleveland's grave as well. That's in the same cemetery.
Yeah.
It's the Grover. If you drive in, they're kind of close to each other. The one is on the right-hand side, going that way, and then the other one's to the left near the road. This election got very negative. I mean, we talk about elections negative today. I mean, President Adams was called a hideous homorphidical character, which was neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. That's pretty nasty. Then Adams was labeled a fool, a hypocrite, a criminal, and a tyrant, and he wanted to attack France. And Jefferson was called a mean-spirited, low-life fellow, a son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father. So things got quite ugly in those days. I mean, we think things are bad between Trump and Biden. It was pretty bad back then between Jefferson and Adams. And then Martha Washington pipes in here and says that Jefferson was one of the most detestable people of mankind. So the founding fathers were a little tough as well. This next elections were a little calmer. I mean, Jefferson got a commanding victory in 1804, Madison as well, and his two elections. You had the War of 1812 in there where the British actually came and burned the White House under the Madison administration. Then we move into an interesting time period. James Monroe is the next president. His first election is competitive. His election in 1820 was non-competitive. Everybody said, let's all rally against James Monroe. And everybody said, this is America's changing. It's the era of good feeling. From now on, politics is going to be wonderful and not this dangerous kind of thing. Little did they know. This election, the election of 1824, is one of the most famous consequential elections in history. And you have Andrew Jackson, who is kind of the founder of what we would call today the Democratic Party. He was kind of in opposition to the idea of kind of an elite running the government. He wanted it to be more for the people. He ran in this election. As you can see, he got all the popular vote, but he only got 97 electoral votes, so he didn't get enough to win with the 131 that he needed. So Clay, Henry Clay, who was a very active guy, supported John Quincy Adams, who was the son of John Adams. And Adams won what they call the corrupt bargain. Basically, he cut a deal, and then Congress actually gave the election to Adams. And this caused a lot of tension. And so it also created a spark in Jackson to win the next election. And it's also interesting because 4 candidates from the exact same party ran against each other. So the tranquility of 20 was not present in 24. New Jersey went for Jackson. The next election is the one that was one of the considered one of the first modern election where it was considered more people were participating especially for Jackson's followers. But it also got particularly ugly, and there's a lot of mudslinging that went along with this. New Jersey went for Adams in this election as well. Some of the stuff that the mudslinging that took place, Jackson was known for a fierce temper, and he'd killed somebody, and they had a lot of stuff that went out about him being a murderer. His wife Rachel was supposedly a bigamist. She had married him before her divorce went through, and that caused a big thing. Jackson's mother, this is what the newspaper said about, from Adams's newspaper, it said Jackson's mother was a prostitute brought to the U.S. by British soldiers and later married a mulatto man. So this was kind of really going for it, you know. Adams accused of corruption with the federal overreach, and one of the ones that we always loved was when Adams was an ambassador, because he had been an ambassador in Russia, that he supposedly was the pimp for the Tsar. That was the mudslinging that went on. Pretty weird. And then also he supposedly put a pool table in the White House for gambling. The next election, Andrew Jackson wins a very large percentage, one of the big ones out there. Henry Clay, again, is involved in this. He becomes the perpetual candidate, kind of the William Jennings Bryan of his day. And he also, at this time, founds a party that will come out and be very prominent, which is the Whig Party, which was Henry Clay's kind of party that he created. Martin Van Buren, who is the vice president of Jackson, wins the next election against William Henry Harrison. And what's fascinating sometimes in American history is you have a person who loses who then will come and be the next one to be the next president. In this case, William Henry Harrison lost to Van Buren, but he will then rise into the next election. A thing that's notable about this election is that Richard Johnson, who is the VP for Martin Van Buren, he had a common law wife who was a former slave. And the Southerners were very angry about this, and they would not cast their electoral votes for him. So he's the only candidate for vice president that they ever had to be put to the Senate to be selected. And that was because of the racial issue. Now, what happens next is that William Henry Harrison wins the election against Martin Van Buren. This was his, and Van Buren suffered under a panic that took place at that time with the banks and the financial system. And so Harrison won with the first candidate from the Whig Party. Now, Harrison is most well known for the guy that went to the inauguration without his trench coat or his hat on in the rain, and he was also the oldest president up to that point ever elected, and within 30 days he got pneumonia and died. And this caused, I mean, this sounds, today we're like, okay, the vice president took over. At this time, Tyler was the president. He was down on his farm in Virginia and had no idea that he was going to have to do anything as vice president. He just, it was like a kind of a ceremonial job that he had gotten. Suddenly he's the president, and this caused huge problem for the Whig Party because Tyler was a real maverick and didn't follow their policies. And he was called like his fraudulency and all kinds of different things during this term. And seeing that the next election, he was not put up for re-election. Instead, James Polk becomes the candidate from Tennessee. And Henry Clay, again, in his third outing here, runs against Polk, but gets close. I mean, look how close that election was as far as numbers. That was a very close election. And Polk wins. Now, Polk is considered by many historians to be one of the more outstanding presidents of the 1800s, primarily for a lot of his foreign policy activities with the Mexican War, and then some of his other policies concerning California and various statehoods that he brought in under his tenure. So he's one of the people in this era, because a lot of times this era is considered kind of the down period of U.S. history as far as presidents. This is one of my earliest things in my collection, William Henry Harrison thing, and they talk about age discrimination now with people calling themselves names for candidates being old, but they called him Granny and said he was senile. And this is when one of the great campaign slogans came, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And what this was is Tippecanoe was this battle against the Indians that Harrison had won. And so his nickname was Tippecanoe, and Tyler, of course, was his VP. And Van Buren, who he was running against, was actually painted as this wealthy guy, but actually Harrison lived on a huge plantation, but he tried to make it sound like he lived in a log cabin. The next few elections is what my professor in college called the dough-faced presidents, guys that were not particularly great leaders and fairly not memorable, from what they did. And that would be Zachary Taylor, who is mostly known from dying in office, and then Millard Fillmore, the guy up in the left, becomes president for a brief time. Millard Fillmore I always loved because his final words after he had a meal was, "The nourishment was palatable." This is my final words, which is a classic. So anyway, these are different elections. Pierce is the guy that's right down here. His distinction about his election was he was elected president and he was on his way to his inauguration with his wife and son, and there was a train crash and his son was terribly killed in front of him on the way to the inauguration. His wife, the entire presidency, was dressed in black and would not have any receptions in the White House. Buchanan, probably one of the most qualified people to be president, but one of the most ineffective presidents. His big distinction for him is he ran against John Fremont up here. If people think Trump's crazy, they ought to talk about Fremont. Fremont was a wild man. He was traveling all over the place, you know, doing all kinds of adventurous things. He was definitely a character, but he was the first Republican candidate, and he did pretty well in this. And this was kind of setting the stage for Lincoln, because Lincoln became the second Republican candidate to run for president. The election of 1860, when people say that this current election is the most consequential election in American history, I think 1860 was a little more important. With Abe Lincoln, he comes in and gets a very small percentage for a win, only 39% of the election, but it was split between a lot of regional candidates, Breckinridge from the Southern Democrats, John Bell, which was more of a Western candidate, and then Stephen Douglas, Midwest. Lincoln, the one thing that's interesting here from New Jersey's perspective, this is the only election where they split the electoral vote. And personally, I feel that's the way it should be, where if you can split the electoral vote, it's fairer for people. In this case, Lincoln ended up with 4 and Douglas had 3.
Was that based on congressional districts or the popular vote? How did they decide that that could be split?
I'm not sure how it was done. It might be similar to Maine, the way Maine does it. I mean, Maine's one of the few states, then and Nebraska, I think, is the other one that.
Proportionate representation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it proportional or is it winner take all?
No,
Oh no! See what
congressional district, each.
Yeah, I think they divide the state up somehow, because the way Maine does it, they divide it up.
Can it be split now, or does it have to be?
It's winner take all. All states are winner take all, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, which is sad, because I mean, I think it makes it fair, you know. Although
Maine has 1 electoral vote per congressional district, and the other 2 are statewide.
yeah. So the election of 1864 is the next one. This is a really, I mean, people think it was, you know, Lincoln was going to be a shoo-in, but he was very worried, and because the war wasn't going so well, and luckily Grant delivered him some victories here, and Sherman. McClellan, which is definitely a New Jersey connection, he became the governor later on. New Jersey voted all their electoral votes for him. He had been the first commander for Lincoln, and then eventually, got fired. And then he became this kind of candidate at first that was kind of having more Southern sympathies, but at the end he kind of threw his weight, with more of the policies that Lincoln was doing, but lost the election.
McClellan was from New Jersey.
He became the New Jersey governor.
There's a street in Newark named
Yep.
after him.
Yeah, he was definitely one of those key New Jersey figures. But he only won New Jersey, Kentucky, and Delaware. This is a weird election, 1868, because the president at the time, who was Andrew Johnson, was being impeached. And there was no chance that he was going to be picked as the candidate for, to run in 68, but it was going on during that election year. Grant becomes the candidate. He's very popular, and as you see, he wins with a big margin of 52% against Seymour, which I recently got a campaign item from Seymour. It's one of those forgotten candidates from the 1800s. The election of 1872, one of the very interesting elections, because what happens here is Horace Greeley was a newspaper man, and he ran against Grant. And right before the election was over, his wife over on the corner over there, she died. And it was a very big shock to him, and he just emotionally broke down, and the election takes place. He did end up getting 66 electoral votes, but within a month after the conclusion of the election, he died as well. And so it created this constitutional crisis. What do you do when a presidential candidate dies? In this case, the faithless electors, 63 of them, threw their stuff towards Grant because they figured it was a foregone conclusion. And he would have won anyway. This is an election that I wrote a paper about in college, the election of 1876, one of the most consequential elections in American history, because what happens here is, as you can see, the original count was 165 to 184. 3 states were in play, or 4 states were in play, and a lot of it was a deal that the Democrats cut with Hayes, that he would pull the troops out of the South. And by doing that, he was not guaranteeing the safety of the freed slaves that were there. And so what happened was, this began the what they call the Compromise of 1877, created the Jim Crow era in the South, because there were no protections. And Hayes ended up, he was called his fraudulency. And actually, one of the things that I'd heard was that shortly, I think the weekend of his inauguration, someone actually tried to shoot a bullet through the window of the White House while he was in the House. Tilden is one of the first. He won, as you can see, he got the popular vote of 4,300,000, significantly higher than Hayes's number. And this is one of those elections in history where popular vote was different from electoral vote.
Isn't this the time when the compromise with Rutherford Hayes also created the KKK?
Probably would have happened at that time, because what happened was, by pulling the troops out, there was absolutely no guarantee of anything in the South, like especially if the states that were concerned here, like South Carolina and Louisiana. I mean, it was free for all. It was really, and then lynching, from that point, lynching started to increase, going on for like the decades that followed. Hayes also, just going back here, one other thing I was going to say is, pictures I've seen of him, he is definitely a guy that you figured that he would leave his dinner in his beard. He had one of the craziest beards of any president of the United States. Election of 1880, this is an election where it was kind of these 2 political groups, the stalwarts and the half-breeds, were fighting with each other. And this is also near, I'm going to show you some great pictures of art. There was terrific political art going on at this time of all the different characters that were involved. And Grant was out there, and he was trying to get a 3rd term, because he had said, okay, we got Hayes doing his thing, because he had originally agreed not to run again, because technically, constitutionally, you could run multiple times. And so Grant resurfaces with Conklin. This is Roscoe Conklin up in the right hand. He's like kind of the power broker, trying to get Grant as the candidate. And what they call waving the bloody shirt, what that was is they would start to talk about the Civil War and say, oh, those horrible Democrats waving the bloody shirt, they're the ones who are behind it, And so that became kind of the campaign thing. Hancock was the candidate, and that's the guy in the corner over there for the Democrats. I think Weaver is, do I have Weaver up here? I don't think I have Weaver up here. No, I don't think there's any pictures of him. Anyway, this is some of the cool political art that happened at that time. There's all kinds of different characters here fighting with each other. Garfield over there crying. This has got, you've got Roscoe Conklin, you've got Grant, you've got, that's Blaine over there. You got this one with different things, Hancock over there, Roscoe Conklin whipping the tiger. This one I like, because it's Roscoe Conklin trying to pick which candidate. Is it going to be Blaine? Is it going to be Grant? Is it going to be Tilden? All the different people that are available at that time. So some real great political art during this time period. And then the next election are the 3 Cleveland elections. I mean, this is a person who, one of the unusual things in U.S. history, someone that runs in 3 elections. I mean, Richard Nixon did as well, but in this case, the big theme there was rum, Romanism, and rebellion. This was the tag on the Democrats, was they were anti-prohibition, they were Catholic, and they were the ones behind the Civil War, the rebellion. So that was kind of, and these mugwumps were the New York State Party that was kind of lurking around, that were a little bit on the, kind of supporting different candidates. The Cleveland wins this election, but you can see it was a squeaker, very close. Only a matter of like 20,000 votes, he beats Blaine. Blaine was a figure from Maine, a very powerful man in the Congress at that time. New Jersey went for Cleveland. This picture on the bottom here was that Cleveland had supposedly sired a illegitimate child, and so this became a big political thing during the campaign, kind of against him, that he had this child out there. The next election is what's considered another election where the popular vote did not match the electoral vote. Harrison was able to win the electoral vote with 233, but he lost the popular vote. As you can see, Cleveland has the popular vote. During Cleveland's presidency, he had gotten married, and his wife, Frances, as they were leaving, told the people there, "Keep the furniture, we'll be back." And she was correct. New Jersey, all 9 electoral votes went for Cleveland in that election. Cleveland comes back in 1892, and he wins with a bigger margin here, with the help of Weaver as a third-party candidate. You'll note in these days that a lot of these third-party candidates were able to actually get electoral votes. He was a Western candidate, so he was able to win some of the Western states. It's more difficult for third-party candidates these days to be able to wrestle any votes away. Cleveland wins from Harrison. Harrison's wife also passed away, and Harrison would, like Cleveland, who also married a younger woman, would marry a second wife that was much younger than him. Weaver was the only third-party nominee between 1860 and 12 to carry a single state. 7 Western states he won, which is pretty significant. And again, New Jersey went for Cleveland again. This election was the election that provides a New Jersey candidate, who's Hobarth. He was the vice president, and he was from the Patterson area. And this was a front porch campaign where McKinley didn't go out and campaign anywhere. He just sat in Ohio and had people come to him. But he was very popular. He was actually a war leader, a war general from the Civil War as well. A lot of the candidates in the 1800s had military experience from the Civil War. And Bryan's big thing was, at the time, the gold standard was in place, but it was considered only the rich people had the gold. So the silver issue was make silver an important part for currency and money, so that the common man could have a better chance. And that was his big thing, silver. He was called the Great Commoner. He was only 36 years old when he ran for president. He's one of the youngest people to run. Yes.
Excuse me, Brian. If you add up the total of the votes, the popular votes, 13.6 million people, how big was the country around that time?
Remember, women didn't vote, so it was, yeah.
We're like 330 million.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
also slaves and other people.
yeah, they didn't vote. Yeah, yeah.
No.
No.
One at a time, when blacks were.
Well, it was a poll. There was a poll tax too in the South where you had to be able to pay to vote. Yeah. And it was amazing when you really look at, like, up until 1920, the population of the U.S. was not very large. It kind of went exponentially.
The population, well,
Yeah,
ballpark,
yeah. I'm not sure what it was at that point, but I think,
so small.
yeah. And one of the things about this election was they had this thing called the virgin vote. They wanted people to vote their first time for one party or the other, because they figured once they would be clinched for life. And so it's this big thing, the virgin vote, that people would try to get the young person who was of that age to vote for of course it was a man, because only men voting at that time.
Yeah, and also it was white male
Yeah,
landowners.
exactly. Especially in the,
How many landowners?
well, in the South. In the South, you had the poll tax. Yeah, Bryan, he's definitely one of the youngest candidates. Now, one of the dilemmas that happens for McKinley here, he's a very popular president. You have the Spanish-American War that takes place, and the U.S. is victorious. And Hobart dies suddenly. They have this guy in New York who's kind of causing trouble for the party, Teddy Roosevelt. They're like, we want to get rid of this guy. Let's give him a non-consequential job. Let's make him vice president of the United States. He becomes vice president, and suddenly, within the first year of McKinley's second term, he gets assassinated up in Buffalo at the Pan American Festival, exhibition. And actually what was happening was the guy came up in line with a handkerchief over the gun to shake hands with him and shot him in the stomach. But this causes a dilemma for the party because they don't trust Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was from the progressive side of the Republican Party. But Roosevelt becomes very popular. I love this button. Someday I'll own it. It's a very expensive button to have, but it's one of the key Roosevelt election buttons for his re-election. And this is also a distinction. This guy Parker that's up in the corner, in election collectibles, very few stuff was produced because he was just seen as going to lose. And so when you go to collect to get any kind of Parker thing, it's much more expensive than other stuff from this era. And As you can see here, here's Roosevelt with his candidate in the corner there. And that's always a valuable thing when you get both candidates, both the president and the vice president, on a button. This is also the period of time when buttons started to become more popular. Prior to that, everything was banners and different other types of materials for campaign type of things. Parker also, I don't know if this is still true, he had the distinction of being the only vice presidential candidate that did not have a book written about him. So if there's anybody out there that wants to write a book that's not been written, write one about Parker. The election of 1908, this was where Roosevelt, because he had done the first term that was McKinley's, he was reelected in 04 and did that. He made a vow and said, I will not run for the third term, which later he would regret deeply. And he picks his hand-picked successor, Taft, to be that, and he worked to get Taft elected. So Taft, and again, William Jennings Bryan surfaces again here for his third try, and loses again to a Republican candidate. This next election is one of the most interesting elections in U.S. history, the election of 1912. And this one, as you can see, Wilson, again, the lowest amount since Lincoln, only 41% that he gets. And the reason why he got that was Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote. It was one of the first times they had primaries. Roosevelt went out because he was very angry with Taft because he felt Taft was not following the policies that he had implemented as president. And so he became kind of his adversary. And a lot of these, he came up with all these like negative terms for Taft, like he called him a puzzle wit and a fathead. And one of the things that makes this election interesting is that Roosevelt won most of the primaries. And it got to the convention, and basically the smoke-filled room decided, we don't care what the people say, we're still going to pick Taft as the candidate. So Taft becomes the candidate. Roosevelt decides to go with what's called the Bull Moose Party, which was a party that was a third party that he was involved with. To throw even more craziness to the election, a week before or a couple weeks before the campaign's supposed to end, Roosevelt is out in Milwaukee making a speech, and he gets shot in the chest by an assassin. And luckily he had this big heavy speech and his eyeglass case that stopped the bullet. But of course, being Teddy Roosevelt, the macho guy he was, he's like, I'm going to do the speech anyway. So he goes out to the place. His shirt is white, covered with blood. They tried to stop me, but they couldn't stop me. And he does this whole speech. And afterwards, his doctors weren't happy about it because the wound was, not totally serious, but it was, he should have gone to the hospital. But that, yes.
I understand Wilson was from New Jersey.
Yes.
Was there any other presidents from New Jersey?
No, he was kind of a little bit a distinction. He was originally from Staunton, Virginia, and he came to New Jersey as the president of Princeton, and he was a very successful president of Princeton, where he changed Princeton from being like a kind of a school for rich boys into, a decent university. And then he became governor, and he was governor for only one term, and during that term he ran for president.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah.
Robert Cleveland was born in New Jersey.
Yeah,
He was politically active in New York.
Yes. Yeah, and Cleveland is one that is actually the only one that's buried in New Jersey. Yeah, Wilson is actually buried in Washington, D.C., in the cemetery in Washington.
Also, this was the term when the World War I that happened about 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the World War I term. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's coming. That's actually, what's really interesting, this is a fascinating period of time in U.S. history. I had a professor, Alan Lichtman, who actually is the guy that predicts elections, the one that's, he has figured out everything since 1980 to the present. He's only missed one, which was 2000. But he was one of my professors, and he said to me, the early 20th century, from 1900 to 1930, is one of the most fascinating periods in U.S. history. And I'm like, why? I just didn't really get it. The more I study this period of time, it's unbelievable. You had all these amendments being passed to the Constitution, like women getting the vote, prohibition. You had the Senate no longer elected by internally, it was elected by people. You had the Fed established. You had all these different type of changes coming to America, the progressive stuff coming in where food and drugs were monitored, and because it was so bad, the level of toxicity to what was it, and pollution. You had the national parks established. Very interesting time period.
And also foreign policy was slowly starting to take center stage.
Yes.
Not until,
Yeah, and Roosevelt was a big one on that because he's the one with the Great White Fleet. He actually created this naval group that went all around the around the world to kind of show America's power, which also came out of the Spanish-American War. Because McKinley was considered in many cases the first modern president because he was definitely trying to make us look more global.
He also got the 14 point, I think, right?
That's later.
But later.
Yeah, okay. So what happens here is Wilson gets elected. Again, he's elected with only 41%, a low amount. So he wasn't tremendously popular. One of the weird things that people don't realize what happened to Wilson was the first year he's president, his wife dies, and he goes into this total funk. And this is right when World War I comes out, and the guy is pretty much like just in a depressed state for almost a year until people around him found him another woman. And then he got married, and then he was fine. But I mean, a lot of people, I was reading about this, and I'm like, this must have been terrible for America. And at a point of time when World War I was around, and we really needed good leadership, he was pretty much not there. The next election is also a very interesting election in 1916 because Hughes, who eventually became a Supreme Court justice, was thought to be the one that was going to win. And in fact, the papers came out and said like he was going to win. He went to bed that night in New York and said, "I'm the winner." And he woke up in the morning and Wilson had actually squeaked a win through. But as you can see, ultimately Wilson had a pretty commanding lead, but at the time, I guess the polls and the people felt it was different. Also, he has a distinction, Hughes, of being the last presidential candidate to run with a beard. There hasn't been a single person since. That was the end of the beard era. This, of course, is the newspaper that's up there. New Jersey went for Hughes in that election. Now, one of the things that takes place before we were talking about the war, going back to this, I didn't kind of bring this up. A lot of this had to do, he kept us out of war because Wilson had run on that campaign during this election and said, I'm the guy that's going to keep you peace. As soon as the election is over, within a few months, the submarine activity in the Atlantic becomes very difficult, and also other things, and then Wilson declares war. So we go to war in 1917, the first year of his second term. And the war lasts for a very short time for an American war. It starts in 17. By November of 18, it's all over. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is of the 116,000 people that died in World War I for the U.S., 66,000 of them were from the Spanish flu.
1917 was also an interesting year because there was a Russian Revolution.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's so much going on at that period of time. And that, of course, was because of the war. Because what had happened was Russia had weakened their position so much that they were able to take power.
Bolshevik.
This election is a reaction to the war. Because what happened was, it's kind of hard to imagine, but World War I was kind of a mini mobilization of what happened during World War II, where everything, all industry and all activity went into the war effort. And so everybody kind of, after, even though it's only lasted a couple of years, they were very exhausted by the whole process. And they wanted to go back into a more normal situation because also the economy had kind of gone down. So they went for Harding in this election of 1920 against another candidate that political buttons are very rare on Cox because he was also considered one that was going to lose. So they didn't produce very much at all. And Harding got the most commanding victory of any candidate in New Jersey. He won 67% of the vote in New Jersey for Harding. And actually Cox's running mate was, as you can see up on the corner there, Franklin Roosevelt, which a lot of people don't realize. He was the vice presidential candidate in 1920.
Harding was not the first choice of the Republicans. He was a fairly obscure senator.
Yes.
Who really had no presidential ambitions at all.
Nope.
There was
he was a publisher originally, a newspaper man.
Yeah, from Ohio.
Yeah.
But it was another backroom deal.
Oh yeah.
That gave him the nomination.
The smoke-filled room.
Right.
Thinking about that, how many ballots did the Democratic Convention have to go through to get to Cox? I know.
Well, it's worse the next one. See, this one wasn't as bad. It's the election of 24 where it really gets crazy with the Democrats. But oh yeah, that's coming. Yeah, yeah. What happens is he's elected, and they think it's a good thing, and then shortly into his administration, a lot of corruption occurs. He's supposed to be enforcing prohibition, and he had alcohol in the White House and was having these wild parties and things, and he was a little bit
Harding may not have been corrupt, but he certainly had.
He was associated with, like Dougherty and different people involved in Teapot Dome.
Yeah, he got the blame for it, but the truth of the matter is, Harding appointed a lot of his cronies
Yes.
from Ohio
Yep.
into high positions.
Yep.
And they were just milking.
Well, it's the same problem with Grant too, because Grant was, a lot of the corruption wasn't directly connected to Grant, but he had people that he put in power, like his own family, that ended up very much involved in the corruption. So anyway, Harding his big thing is what they call normalcy, which this is when it became in the dictionary from this election, and it's still, people talk about it, as something that America aspires to, where after COVID you wanted normalcy, you wanted to return to like a common, better era. Now Coolidge was able to successfully not be associated with the Harding scandals. And so he runs in 24 and actually has a sound, pretty good victory here against Davis. Davis is a candidate. 103 ballots it took for Davis to be selected as the candidate for the Democrats. So it was grueling. It went on, the Democratic convention went on and on, day after day after day. The fight was between McAdoo, who was like the pro-Klan member of the party, who was actually the former son-in-law of Wilson. He had married one of Wilson's daughters. Al Smith was the Catholic from New York, who was connected with Tammany and a lot of corruption as well, but he was the first Catholic candidate. He tried to get the nomination that year, but because of the shenanigans from McAdoo, he was not able to get it. So Silent Cal won, and of course the famous story with Silent Cal was somebody said they couldn't get him to say 2 words, and he said, "You lose." So anyway, so Coolidge wins, and again, one of the things, he gets this famous iconic picture of him with the Native American headdress, which I don't think any president would do that these days. But he was also very important in Mount Rushmore. Like I was out in Mount Rushmore 2 years ago, and Coolidge was a very important guy in making that happen. I mean, he got the the money for the U.S. to get the sculptures and everything done. He was a very important figure there.
Coolidge's vice president was a Native American. Was.
Oh, was he?
Native American.
Was he? Oh, okay, I didn't realize that.
First.
The election of 1928, this was the big one where it was the first Catholic candidate, and of course all the nasty stuff came out. Also, there was the whole Prohibition thing. Prohibition was cruising along. The problem with Prohibition was it was called the Noble Experiment, but nobody was really into enforcing it. So what you had is you had police forces. Even in South River, I found old newspaper articles where you'd see there was this raid and the police did nothing. And I'm like, okay, now you really know what was going on, is that the local enforcement and also the judicial. There was one guy in South River that was charged multiple times but never did jail time. So he'd get in front of the judge and, we'll let you go. So that was one of the issues. It was also the legacy of Tammany Hall, which was the corrupt force in New York City, which, Smith was definitely connected with that. So he ran, he was defeated by Hoover. Now, if there's ever been an election where you win in such an incredible victory, 444 electoral votes, and within 9 months, things go real bad fast. So then Hoover, and actually I have a picture at home. My grandfather went on this trip in 1925 down to Washington, D.C. and I have a picture, it's a panoramic picture of Hoover in front of the Capitol building with all this whole delegation from Maine. At the time, he was Secretary of Commerce. He was a very important guy in helping people from Belgium after World War I. He helped feed them. He was very much of an altruistic guy.
In fact, his one loss changed the history of the U.S. forever.
Yeah.
Total history.
Yeah.
Because the one who came after him.
Oh yeah, very much, definitely. Oh yeah,
Painted
exactly.
Picture.
And it's amazing with Hoover is he resisted it up to that election too. He believed he was right. Of course, Babe Ruth went for Al Smith. In the election here, as you were saying, election of 1932, a very critical election. It's fascinating when you look at what happened with the Depression, because the crash happens in 29, and it's like kind of a slow kind of burn until it got badder and badder and badder. By 1932, things had gotten quite bad. I know, like in South River, for instance, there were a lot of children that were hungry. and they actually had like food collections that they would provide for the schools. And a lot of people were out of work. People that had office jobs were on the road, you know, digging ditches in their suits. You know, things were quite bad. And so this is what kind of propelled Roosevelt into power. Also, there were the veterans from World War I. They were supposed to be getting this bonus to help them, and the bonus marchers came to Washington and protested, and they became the Hoovervilles, they called the places where the homeless were. And so Hoover kind of fought hard because he believed that his kind of more laissez-faire process of handling the economy was the correct way, but he lost the election. But you can see on Inauguration Day, he did ride in the car with Roosevelt, which I thought, considering everything that was going on, is pretty amazing. This next election was kind of the referendum on the New Deal, and Landon lost significantly, only winning 8 electoral votes, a great landslide for FDR. Landon, this is the symbol. These are, anytime you find the campaign stuff out there, it's always the sunflower. It's kind of a neat little thing. His daughter would go on to be a senator as well, and then she married, I think, Baker, right? Is that right? Am I right, Don?
Well, she was Nancy Kastenbach.
Yeah, and she married Baker, Howard Baker. Yeah, yeah. So they, but yeah, he was a very political. Even after he lost this election, he was still a very big part of the Republican Party for a number of years, as well as Hoover as well. Hoover actually tried to run again in 1940. This is a guy. My dad taught me this little thing back in the when I was a kid. Is a horse's tail is white and silky, lifted up and there is Wilkie. That was one of the little negative things that came out. Wilkie was kind of a character. He was a businessman, and he was not, you know, like the main guy from the party, because Taft was the guy, Robert Taft, that was the one that was a conservative that wanted to be the presidential candidate that year. Wilkie ended up getting the nod because they wanted to try to shake things up against Roosevelt and provide something new and something different. He was a maverick, and he was such a maverick, and there was a big slogan they had: Washington wouldn't, Grant couldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't. And a lot of the campaign buttons have things against the third term for this election. They also said, I'm not for Eleanor either. That was one of the campaign buttons I have.
I think Wilkie's big problem was he agreed with Roosevelt on so many issues, especially internationally.
And you know the fascinating thing was,
He alienated his own party.
And once Roosevelt won, he appointed Wilkie as an advisor. Yeah.
He sent him to England.
Yeah. So yeah, that was part of the problem. But they were trying. The problem was, the whole movement in the country was going towards a certain way, and they felt that if they went against it, which like people like Lindbergh and others were being much more conservative and isolationist, it just wasn't the way things were going. And actually New Jersey went for Roosevelt. Dewey is the next candidate here against Roosevelt in 1944. I read an incredibly interesting book about this election. If this election was held today, there is no way that Roosevelt would have won, because he was so physically disabled to be president. He only made very few appearances. One of the appearances he made was in Fenway Park. He came in there, they drove his car in, and he actually made a speech in the center of Fenway Park. And one of the great political items I have in my collection is I have a ticket from that speech that I have. But he also did a broadcast, I think, on the radio. But he made very few appearances because, as you can see even from the picture up there, he was very gaunt. He was dying of heart disease and high blood pressure. He had smoked for years and really hadn't taken care of himself. And of course, he had polio, so he's physically disabled as well. One of the fascinating things about the Roosevelt years was there was only one surviving photograph that was ever taken of him in a wheelchair. You know, they always tried to photograph him standing up with braces to kind of project this more image of power. Dewey, lost this election, and again, this was in the midst of the war, and people felt, they wanted to stick with Roosevelt. My mother, she was born in 1927, and she said her entire period of time growing up in school, the President of the United States was Franklin Roosevelt, because she graduated in 1945.
Thank God there wasn't a widespread media.
Oh, I know.
It was all over.
I know, it would have been.
President coughed.
It would have been bad. The election of 48 is an interesting one. The famous Dewey defeats Truman, because Dewey was thought to be a shoo-in, like he was going to win, and everybody pretty much. Truman became, after he dropped his big decision was dropping the nuclear bomb. He did that, ended the war. And then there was a lot of things going on with different types of labor problems and other issues in the country. He also broke the rules as far as segregation of the military. And this kind of alienated the southern part of the Democratic Party. And that's why Strom Thurmond ran that year and got 39 electoral votes, primarily because of the integrating the military that Truman did. And so by siphoning off those votes, that was considered a big factor, what would happen to Truman. But Truman was able to squeak through with a victory anyway, and this three-way split. So you can't trust the polls.
Yeah, that's a journalism background, and for us, that's a big masterpiece.
Oh yes.
Showed
Oh yeah.
Big masterpiece as to how the polls can get it wrong.
Oh yes.
And they preemptively declared it.
Oh yeah.
That's very embarrassing for the whole.
The same thing with Hughes too. I mean, the newspapers did the same deal,
Yeah. Look at him laughing, and he's.
Oh, I say, look at yeah, exactly.
That's embarrassment.
But the difficulty in that period of time is you wanted to have the exclusive, because you wanted to be, when people woke up in the morning, you wanted to be able to, they have it.
Yep.
And sometimes papers would publish 2 times a day, so sometimes they could get it right. If they screwed it up in the morning, they could fix it in the evening.
Something similar happened in New Jersey in 2021 gubernatorial election. New Jersey, Monmouth University apologized for having such predicting such a slender margin.
Oh, really?
Wide margin between the candidates, and turned out to be only 3.5%.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So.
It's credible. Now, this election is the popular war hero. Now, one of the things people will say is, why didn't Truman run for another term? Because he was eligible. He was considered by this point not popular, because the Korean War had broken out. This was not a particularly popular war. Eisenhower is thought as a military leader. He can come in there, straighten that whole situation out. He comes in, wins a very commanding lead, probably the second biggest one since Hoover, and he gets the unpopular. The Kivar is one of the people that ran with him, and the Cold War was a big issue, which McCarthy had been a big figure in the party, and Eisenhower had come out against him. And of course the Checker speech is another important thing. This is where Richard Nixon had supposedly taken gifts that were from different people that he shouldn't have taken, and so to save his political career, he went on the TV and made this speech called the Checker speech, where he basically said, we didn't do anything wrong, and the only thing we took was a dog, Checkers, and it's my daughter's dog, and I really don't want to give him back. So it got all this sympathy from people, and so it saved Richard Nixon's political career.
Was that a big recession, big enough to impact a presidential outcome?
What's weird is there were I think it was 2 recessions that took place during the 50s, and Eisenhower's popularity was just enough to overcome it. It's really a case that it's pretty unusual, and you're right, because usually recession spells election difficulty, but he was able to overcome those recessions. He also had a lot of really bad physical things happen to him. He had a heart attack, I think 1 or 2 heart attacks, and at one point, Nixon could have got the presidency from death of Eisenhower as well.
The reason I asked is that recession, 1929 is, but that recession is not emphasized enough in the academic books in the public schools.
Yeah, it's fairly small. Yeah, well, I don't think it was probably more like a minor recession, but it was there. Yeah, because it was definitely out there. And this guy, the guy Stevenson, if you see up here with the shoes, the big thing of the campaign was he had a hole in his shoe. And so Stevenson came out and said, this is because I'm working so hard. And then the Eisenhower campaign came out and said, this is because he's really a bad candidate. He's not what you want. He's like got a hole in his shoe, So they kind of spun the thing. That's Stevenson, which Stevenson kind of, I think, when with the Dr. Strangelove, the movie came out, they kind of modeled the character after him. He kind of looks like that in there because my parents split on that. My father voted for Stevenson. My mother was voting for Ike. And this election ended up being a repeat from the previous election. There's not a lot of times in history where this happens, where a defeated candidate comes back for a second try, but Stevenson did. And as you can see here, he didn't do any better the second time. Yeah, exactly. And he went on to be the ambassador to the UN, and he's in the famous scene where he's confronting the Russians and he's telling ready to like hell freeze over, you know, that kind of that line. So it's now this election is a very pivotal election in U.S. history for a lot of reasons. Of course, you know, this brought the famous debate between Kennedy and Nixon. And the thing that's kind of interesting on this is people that listened to this debate on the radio clearly said that Nixon had won. But if they watched it on TV, they said that Kennedy won. And they also thought Kennedy looked like this healthful, vibrant guy. In reality, Nixon was much healthier than Kennedy was. Kennedy had a lot of illnesses. But I think Kennedy got his nice pressed shirt before he came out. He looked tan, he looked good, and it really made a big difference. Yeah, exactly. Refused makeup. I think Nixon had hurt his knee prior to the debate, so he was kind of in pain and under some kind of pain medicine. So he lost out. And the thing about this election, which is incredible, is look at the close margin here. One of the closest elections in U.S. history. And again, Harry Byrd is another one of those Southern candidates that was opposing some of the civil rights things that were being proposed. I think Eisenhower had done some action in the previous administration with Little Rock and that type of thing, and so Byrd was kind of reacting against some of the stuff that was going on in the South. So anyway, with this election, Nixon, when it was over, went to Eisenhower and said, "Should I contest this?" Eisenhower said, "For the good of the country, don't contest it. Just go, whatever you need to do, just concede." And so that's what Nixon did. But as you can see, there were some talk of irregularities in Chicago and West Virginia and other places.
Texas.
Yeah, other places, yeah.
Kennedy's father.
Yeah, so little things went on.
And can I just add one
Yeah.
thing? Another significance of this is the first time in the history all 50 states have voted in this election.
That's true, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Hawaii and
Hawaii
that was the first one.
The year before.
And also, from one thing I forgot to say, it's the first time a Catholic president was elected as well. That was a big milestone. And there's this youthful look. I mean, Jackie was young. He looked young. He had a young family. There hadn't been a young family in the White House for many years, probably since Teddy Roosevelt, I think. A very young family. I mean, Coolidge had had a couple of sons. Oh, one thing I didn't mention about Coolidge, when Coolidge was president, his son was playing tennis and got a blister on his heel. And within a matter of 2 weeks, he died, which was a big tragedy for Coolidge and had a big effect on whether or not he would run for re-election. The election of '64, this election, one of the things that's very significant is up here in the corner. There was a famous ad that was called the flower ad. And what it has is a little girl picking flowers, and there's like a countdown that happens in the background, and then they show a nuclear bomb. And the idea is that it's associating Goldwater being like a war hawk, and because he had come out stronger about Vietnam and other foreign policy issues. And so what Johnson was saying is he wasn't going to escalate in Vietnam and other things like that, where he gets elected and he does just the opposite. Also, you get with Goldwater, I like these like HTO type things, gold and water. You can see with the different buttons. It was a lot of the programs that came out here that would come out of this with the Medicare, Medicaid, war and poverty. All of these were proposed and would come through after this election. Yeah, civil rights, big period of a lot going on. New Jersey went for Johnson in a big way, 65%. Not quite a Harding one, but pretty close to Harding. The election of '68, one of the elections I will never forget because I was alive for this and I remember it very clearly. And even in my class, when I was in 4th grade, we all got together and had to vote. And a lot of us would vote the way our parents did. And I lived out in Hunterdon County. It was either Nixon, Humphrey, or Wallace. And Wallace won hands down. So you know what Hunterdon County was about back in those days. So anyway, Wallace gets a commanding 46 votes. Again, this is a lot to do with a reaction to the civil rights movement. He is the anti-civil rights candidate. And so 9 million people, or actually almost 10 million, went for him. This also had the distinction where the incumbent president, after the Tet Offensive, decides that he wants to bow out. And so he leaves. And so then you got McCarthy and Kennedy that were kind of vying for the Democratic nomination. Kennedy gets killed. McCarthy's campaign, because of the assassination, kind of spirals because he just doesn't know how to deal with it. And then Humphrey, who was the vice president under Johnson, elevates to become the candidate. People thought, how the heck are the Democrats going to do anything on this? It's definitely the Republicans going to win. Look at this at the end here. It was an extremely close election. One of the ones that people don't realize how close 68 was. And a lot of it has to do with some talk about the fact that Johnson was saying he was going to cut some deal to end the war. And some people say Nixon undermined it, but there's never been like total great evidence on it. But that was one of the things that said that might have done that. For Nixon, this was a great kind of resurrection of his political career, because in the early part of the 60s, he had basically had this big confrontation with the press and said, you can't kick Richard Nixon around anymore, I'm leaving politics. But then he comes back with the help of, what's the guy's name from, you'd know, from Fox News, Roger Ailes. Roger Ailes becomes his political operative and redoes his whole image during this election. And he ends up winning one of this law and order campaigns, because Wallace was also involved with law and order, but Nixon was able to keep it more middle of the road. And that became the big campaign slogan. New Jersey went for Humphrey in this election.
Wasn't Wallace the first official independent candidate for presidency?
No.
No.
No, I mean there was Roosevelt, there was Bell, there was numerous ones out there, and he ran. I think his party.
And Thurman ran.
Yeah, Thurman ran, and then also Byrd ran. There was a number of them. He got a significant amount though, 46. I think probably. I think Roosevelt got more, but it's pretty large number. The 72 election, this one became the referendum on Nixon, and what Nixon did over this was he was bringing the Vietnam War to a close. He had created the whole situation with China connection and with Russia. He was showing all kinds of foreign policy successes that were out there. And McGovern's running as the anti-war candidate, but the war was winding down. If you look at kind of like one of the things that Nixon did, and I was just reading about this recently, was he saw the protests that were taking place on the campuses. The main issue for the campus kids were getting drafted. He got rid of the draft. And then suddenly the stuff started to happen. Yes?
I remember watching Watergate on TV, and one of the things that happened was the mess that it was. I think it was one of the first trials that was on
PBS
TV for a long time.
Yeah, I remember watching it every day with Sam Ervin and Baker and all the different candidates. Yeah. Actually, I'm going to get into that because 72 is the election, and this is during this election where there's the break-in in the Watergate building. And my first job out of college, I actually worked in the Watergate building, in the 2600 building. So it was kind of cool. Bought my little Nixon doll from like the concession stand, which I still have. But yeah, it was, and across the street was the Howard Johnsons, and that was where G. Gordon Liddy had his team of people that would come across. Now it's a dorm for GW University, I think. And actually the Watergate building, I think now the historic preservation people have taken over that building, and they have their offices in there. But anyway, what happens here is McGovern gets creamed in this election against Nixon. Definitely a huge victory for Nixon. But the problem is, again, it's one of these things where, I also want to just mention the Eagleton thing. Eagleton was the candidate that was running with McGovern, and he had mental health issues where he had I guess, shock treatments or some type of treatments. And this came out, and so he was dropped, and then Shriver became the candidate. Shriver was connected with the Kennedy family. He was a brother-in-law of John F. Kennedy, and he became the candidate for McGovern. So what happens here, the Watergate affair happens after this thing. There's a whole thing with different people from the Nixon administration being convicted. Ultimately, it gets to the point with the tapes where Nixon had kept the tapes. He has to turn them over. He turns them over. They reveal information that makes it where Goldwater and other people in Congress actually go to him and tell him he needs to resign. So he resigns, and then Ford becomes his vice president. Now, what happened with this, the reason why Ford is the vice president was that Spiro Agnew was involved with a corruption scandal and had to resign. So then Ford was selected as the vice president. Now, one of the things with Ford is he's a man that definitely benefited from political office, because apparently when he was appointed vice president, his net worth was very little. After becoming vice president and then president and having the clout of being a president, ended up being like on all different boards all over the country and did quite well. But he was a very well-liked guy, became the president. His big thing was he pardoned Nixon, which I still think was a great decision because it kind of calmed everything down and kind of made people moved on. But people condemned him for it. And it really, but even though they condemned him for it, look at that election, how close it was. And one of the things that came out of this particular election, because Ford was sensed that there was a weakness, he was contested by Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California and our former governor, I think at that point, right? Former governor. And he had a very strong campaign where they were actually went to the convention. At one point, they thought of having a dual presidency kind of thing, and Ford wouldn't agree to it. And you probably know more than I do.
I was the youngest delegate from New Jersey to that Republican convention, which was the last convention of either party, major party, that was still in contest at the convention.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, because now these conventions are just like show things. It's like nothing really significant happens at them. But he's right. Back in that was nobody knew who the candidate was going to be. Some thought it was going to be Reagan. Some thought it was going to be Ford. Ford ultimately gets it. And as you can see, he almost won. I mean, it was not a very big margin that Carter won by. Carter is this unknown kind of guy that came out of the governor of Georgia. He was very, very folksy-ish. You know, I have a, the peanut transistor radio that with his face on it, and the Deep South. He was the first president elected from the Deep South since Zachary Taylor in 1848, which is pretty significant. So that was pretty amazing. The next election of '80, and I remember this, I was in college, and John Anderson was the big candidate that was emerging that everybody thought the college kids were going to vote for. Ultimately, he didn't really get that much votes, but he siphoned enough away from Carter. But I don't even think it was enough for him to defeat Reagan. What happened to this was you had the whole Iran hostage situation, which caused a lot of embarrassment for the U.S. with the hostages being held. And Carter was very much of a micromanager of things, and he ended up coming out kind of shown as very negative in many ways, especially about the economy. And so eventually got beat quite soundly. Also, Ted Kennedy came up as a candidate in the primaries against him. And one of the things they always say with any kind of candidacy, if you have a challenger within your own party, it weakens your candidacy. And see, in this case, Kennedy went right up to the convention and wouldn't even shake hands with Carter at the convention, which really hurt Carter's, kind of image there. Carter loses big and eventually concedes. And also, this was the debate for Reagan. I think the first debate, if I remember correctly, Reagan did not do well in, but the second one, he did very well. I love this picture. This just shows a different era in American politics. Everybody just kind of joking around and stuff like that. It wasn't this adversarial thing. But anyway, and Reagan was definitely the kind of guy, like he would go and have drinks with Tip O'Neill, who was the main figure in Congress at the time that was from the opposing party. Very popular, won a huge victory here. Mondale was the whole thing with where's the beef, and then to Hart's new ideas. Hart was this candidate, this youthful candidate that was coming up. But of course, during the campaign, he gets nailed for having the affair with Donna Rice, and his candidacy sinks very rapidly. Reagan carried 49 of 50 states. I mean, this is significant. This is kind of like a Roosevelt kind of election kind of thing. This was a kind of a referendum again on some of his policies that were a big change from what had been there before. The election of '88, what's affected a lot on this is the Iran-Contra thing. What comes out is a scandal under Reagan's administration where supposedly they wanted to get hostages free, so they gave money to the Sandinistas that then money went to Iranians, or some guns were being transferred around. There was all kinds of transfers between countries and things. Reagan was able to get away with this because he really was not directly involved in it, so when they went and brought it in front of Congress, he did not get directly charged with it. There was no impeachment or anything like that. A few people were affected by it, but it did not elevate to a big issue. The guy that was most damaged from it was his vice president, Bush, who was a little bit involved with it. But he ended up another commanding victory a lot of it on the Reagan coattails. Also, what helped him is this fellow, who was an awful candidate, Dukakis. He did this major thing. He insisted on doing this photo shoot on top of a tank at this military base, and he just looked goofy. And it came off really bad. The other thing was, when he was governor of Massachusetts, he had freed this guy, Willie Horton, on the left. And Willie Horton went and then murdered somebody after that. And so that became a big issue during the campaign of him being too soft on crime. And so that was the election there. The election of '92, the big thing with this is my former boss, Ross Perot, I used to work for EDS. He becomes the candidate and definitely spiced things up a little bit and actually pulled enough votes away to really hurt Bush's chances for re-election against Clinton. As you can see, Clinton did not have a commanding victory. He had 43%. Probably if the Perot people had thrown their weight towards Bush's candidate, Bush would have won. And this is also the famous debate where Bush is in the debate and he looks at his watch, which didn't help him, so it made it sound like he didn't want to be there. Perot with the sucking sound from Mexico because he was very anti-NAFTA, which I guess some would say he might have been right. And as you can see, this is again a big third party, but what's showing here is a trend of third party candidates cannot win electoral votes now. It's very difficult, especially if it's not like associated with a state. Oh, one thing I was going to say is New Jersey, this is significant. I haven't been mentioning this, but if you go back here, this election right here is the last election that New Jersey voted for Republican. And this is in 1988. Every election since, you'll notice, they're going blue. They go with Clinton here in this election. And this next election for Clinton, his re-election, also went for Clinton. This election, the economy began to recover from the 90s, so it was a lot more stability. Foreign policy-wise, we didn't really have any wars going on or anything, so there was kind of an era of, and plus Clinton was very clever of stealing the Republicans' issues and reformulating them with his own kind of version of it. And so he did very well and won a pretty commanding victory. Now, of course, as soon as he wins the victory, soon after that became the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which really dampened his whole image. And this would also end up being a situation for, I was going to hold a message here is Perot also ran in this election as well. This hurt this guy, Al Gore, because the whole thing.
I'm sorry, the Supreme Court.
Yeah. This hurt Al Gore because Al Gore, because of the whole thing with Monica Lewinsky, it affected probably where he would have been from the coattails of Clinton, because Clinton had pretty good popularity up until that point. And you went through the whole impeachment thing, you had all this stuff going on. This became a very super close election. The one thing about Gore is he didn't win his own state, which was a big problem. I mean, one of the things with most candidates, they need to win their own state. Florida became the fighting ground with, Chads and different things of that sort. It went to the Supreme Court, and this was the big decision, and the court went and sided with Bush. One of the things that comes out of this is that Bush, as soon as the election was seen to be contested, Jim Baker went to Florida and actually managed the situation down there very well. So this proves that if you have a situation, you got to get good lawyers in there. And it ended up going their way. Even though this, again, is one of those elections in U.S. history where the popular vote was definitely with Gore. The next election of 2004, one of the things that fascinates me about this election as I went back and looked at it was how really close it was. And a lot of this was a referendum on the Iraq war and Afghanistan. And some people were not, in favor of what was going on. So it kind of hurt Bush's image, even though he was tremendously popular after 9/11. And what happens here is because of Ohio and Florida were the key states. Those two states went with Bush, and he was able to win re-election. Now, again, one of these kind of things where sometimes when you win, you lose. Of course, the Great Recession happened shortly after that, and similar things happened to Cleveland with the panic of the early 1890s. Sometimes when you win, you lose. The Great Recession happens in 2008, and this creates a situation where you have the first African-American candidate win. First off, he gets the nomination after a big primary fight with Hillary Clinton, and eventually runs against McCain, who is a very kind of moderate Republican candidate, had a lot of popularity, a war hero from Vietnam, and Obama wins with a pretty sound victory in New Jersey. The big election, also a very good victory as well. One of the things to look here is most candidates for re-election, you want to increase your margin when you go for re-election. So one of the things to look at here is you can see he increased it here. Always helps, like with Nixon in 68 versus 72, increased it. It's always good to get an increase. This one was a referendum on Obama. This could have gone bad because of the Great Recession, but things went well for him. The incumbency helped. The election was definitely a sound victory of 51%. And this is actually what's fascinating is I think this is the last campaign that we've had where a candidate got over 50%. I hope we're not in this era where everything's going to be like squeaker 40, in the 40s, but it's looking kind of that way. And the 14 electoral votes in New Jersey for Obama. This election of 16, first woman candidate, Trump with a surprise win. The polls all said that Hillary was going to win. Hillary kind of neglected a lot of the swing states, and so those became the ones that kind of would hurt her in the end. New Jersey went for Clinton, and that was kind of the way that went out. As you see here, though, the numbers, 46% to 48%. Trump 2020 election, this was the battle of the septarians. COVID-19 was a big issue, racial issues, the economic problems. You've got the whole thing with George Floyd, COVID. It was an incumbent defeat. And again, one of the problems you had here with Trump was, if you're looking at his margins, he did worse than he did from the previous election. And that's always something you want to try to reach new voters as an incumbent, because it's always dangerous in the re-election to lose votes.
I thought that Trump had the 306 in the election of 2016.
He did. See, he had the higher number in 16. What I'm saying is, whatever your first election is, you want to do better on the second one. You want to increase your popularity, because usually you're weakened if you don't.
Because that said 304 in 2016.
Oh, did I have, what was I off by a couple?
Yeah, go back to 2016.
Oh no, I wasn't. Yeah, oops, I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, no, Trump had 304. What I'm saying is he had his numbers. He had as far as his numbers as how many people voted for him. He went down. He went, as far as electorally. See, Biden won with 306. Yeah. But so now we got to figure out what's going to happen in the next election is the big key here. This is the elections, the battle of the old guys, border issues, Gaza, Russia, economic problems. Is it going to be 16? Is it going to be 48? Is it going to be 1980? Is it 92? Is it 2020? Is it 1892 where the person gets reelected that was president before and there was somebody in between? A couple of things I can say as possible predictions. These are the states you need to look for in this election. The green ones are the ones that can switch either way, that are really going to determine what happens. Yeah.
The purple states.
Exactly. They could go either way, because I'm pretty much the ones that are red in here and the ones that are in the blue are pretty much going to go that way. Now, is it going to be a presidential return? Is it going to be a rematch where the one president that lost comes back? Is it going to be an upset where we're going to think one thing's going to happen and then once the election happens, it's a complete upset? Is it going to be a situation where, because we're dealing with older candidates, somebody either dies during the campaign or dies after? It's in the realm of possibility.
Can't take the pressure of the campaign.
Is it going to be unrest? We don't know. But we know if there's unfaithful electors out there, there's a favorite. And that is the end.